Welcome to the Book of Urm, Chapter 9, Pool of Vyoyen. Pool of Vyoyen. Gradually, muffled sounds and blurry light entered Serpendis's consciousness as if filtered through a canvas screen. He was distantly aware of movement and muted voices all around him. He absently felt his body nudged, prodded, and eventually lifted into broader light, and then rolling onto his back. His limbs felt like boneless flotsam hanging from a deflated raft, floating listlessly in an open sea of incoherence. Slowly, painfully, he opened one eye. Bright daylight broke into his vision without remorse, but filling his field of view was Piecora, perhaps the only face in this world he might recognize in his current condition. Her black braids hung all around her face, shielding the bright sun from his eyes like a curtain surrounding his face. What was his current condition, actually? Slowly, his mind began picking up the pieces of yesterday's events until he came to the huge, hulking, single-limbed horror and its enormous, grotesque eye. He must have blacked out again, for he woke up on his side in a fetal position, all of his muscles straining and burning, needles shooting up his arms and legs. He was shaking uncontrollably, sweating and foaming from his mouth. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, and his breathing rode along his convulsions like leaf in a storm. His head ached terribly, and he was madly terrified at having no control over his body and being unable to do anything about it. Someone was on top of him, he realized, and she was humming softly to herself as hands massaged his arms and legs. He felt a cold, wet fabric wrap around his head, and this calmed him a little. In fact, her voice became the center of his world, and as his mind focused on it, everything else gently fell away until eventually he could feel again. He blinked quickly as his eyesight came into focus and his limbs finally relaxed, exhausted. His breathing and his heart slowed down, his mouth was bone dry, and his head pounded on all sides. The figure slowly rose up from him, and he was gently lifted into a seated position against the very same tree that he sat beside when he rested Piecora's head on his lap before falling asleep yesterday afternoon. He again slowly opened his eyes and saw Piecora's face. She was wiping his face with a damp cloth and moving stray strands of gray hair from his eyes and mouth. Karui, Black Lion dancing, knelt on the other side of him, holding his hand. He broke down into uncontrollable sobbing, feeling like he had finally come to his breaking point. He had nothing left in him to withstand anything else this adventure might expose him to. He smelled Piecora's hair and realized she was embracing him, patting his back like a child. "Do you have anything that can heal this?" he heard Piecora ask, close to his ear. "I do, but I was waiting for him to be capable of drinking it." Karui responded. "Here, give this to him." A familiar pungent smell filled his sinuses, its vapors chasing the terrors and tremors away. Piecora lifted a small clay bowl filled with clear liquid to his lips. He grimaced and recoiled from the potion. "Ugh! Is that the root wine from—" "Drink it," Piecora whispered. "Just drink it. It will bring you back around." Without waiting for his response, she pressed it against his mouth and pushed forward, draining the contents into his mouth and forcing him to swallow it. She even ran her hand up and down his throat to help him, like one would do for a pet. It burned all the way down into his stomach, and almost immediately he felt warmth return to his hands and feet, and his eyes snapped into focus. His head still felt numb, his mouth still dry, and he was extremely fatigued. But she was right. He felt himself come all the way back around from the brink. What?" he started, looking at Piecora as if for the first time. But then he noticed she was covered from head to toe in fine white fungal webbing, like the mycelia he saw feeding on the rodent corpse days ago, or weeks, or months. Who knew? Her face, arms, legs, and hands were imprinted with fine webbed lines from where the mycelia pressed against her skin, as if she slept for hours against a heavily knitted fabric. She looked pale, too, like she was coming out of a deep sickness and wasn't quite fully healed yet. She sat back and drew her knees up, still sitting close to him. Plucking at a piece of the mycelia while shrugging her shoulders and shaking her head slowly, she said, "I don't really know. We both were covered in this stuff when I awoke. The last thing I remember was jogging toward the rabbit I had just killed. Then suddenly I was in Hyro, and I watched everything transpire from his eyes. I then went with Karui, and I must say, leaving my own body with an old fool like you had me worried." She looked up at him and smiled weakly. But he was not amused by her humor. "Piecora, I failed you. I fell asleep, and then it was nightfall, and—" He trailed off, lost for words. She laid both of her hands on his hand. "No, you saved us. Both you and me," she said reassuringly. "There was no other way we would have survived the night if you hadn't done what you did. I cannot tell you how thankful I am and how proud I am of you. It was brilliant. What I want to know is, what happened last night after we left? Our bodies were restored by the forest from within the hole that you hid us in, and Karui can explain more on that. But something happened to you that's causing these seizures. I'm afraid if I think of it again, I'll lose control," Serpendis said. Karui placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Tell me what you saw last night. The root wine will keep you together." The way she emphasized the word "saw" made him suspect she might already know. He stared unblinking into her eyes, focusing only on her violet and turquoise retinas, and said, "Something stalks these woods, something large and hideous, only one arm and one leg and a large head with a single gigantic eye that nearly killed me just by looking at it. If you hear a single footstep late at night, hide for dear life and do not look at it." Despite the concoction, he fought to control himself while feeling the terrors welling up within him again. Karui looked down for a long moment, then at Piecora, finally saying, "We need to get out of this forest. The sooner the better, while our luck still holds." She turned to look back at Serpendis, studying him. She cupped his chin with her smooth, delicate hand. This condition will remain with him for the rest of his life, visiting him when he least expects it. Anything can set it off, and there is no way to cure it except for time, I suppose. She caressed his cheek and gently gripped his shoulder. Time and comfort. Karui then rose, saying, "It's not yet midday. We can get to the pool by evening if we leave now." Serpendis looked at Piecora and said weakly, "Pool? Are we going home?" Piecora slowly rose and helped Serpendis stand. "Yes, a pool, a very special place, a place of peace, but not the way home. We are still far from that. Karui and I, well, Hero, we found it yesterday when we left you. But night had fallen before we could return, so we rested there and hoped against all hope that you and my body could survive the night. I had no idea what might happen, especially when the mists arrived in the morning, as I couldn't re-enter my body to even see or hear anything. But you saved both of us, and apparently it could have gone worse than any of us imagined." She then looked back at Karui, who started walking off. "What is this creature that he encountered?" Karui stopped and said, "There are tales of a thing so horrible, so loathsome. To see it is to die. Vyoyen, it is called, among other names. Serpendis somehow survived such a meeting. He is the only one I know who has lived. Humans never cease to amaze me in their endurance and adaptability, but he will live with its effect on him for the rest of his mortal life, I'm afraid. Come, Let's leave this place behind us and never return." Piecora led Serpendis behind Karui as the three ventured into the ancient forest in a different direction than they were heading in. Hiero flew overhead and in front this time, guiding them all to the place that Karui wanted to take them. The going was slow, as Serpendis, for the first time since entering the Fey world, seemed to move according to his elderly age. He stopped often to catch his breath, and he needed help climbing over roots and boulders and ducking beneath heavy vines and low branches. At times, Piecora had him beneath his arm, while Serpendis leaned heavily on her, gasping and wheezing. Finally, when the sun had descended low enough for the trees to cast long shadows across the forest floor, they finally stopped walking. Serpendis was looking down at his dirty sandals, unable to put weight on one cramping foot, while breathing heavily from exhaustion. He heard Piecora say quietly beside him, "We made it. Care for a look?" She lifted his head with her hand beneath his grizzly bearded chin. They stood at the edge of a small clearing of gigantic ancient trees, all twisting and intertwined with each other. There would be no way to notice this place if they were merely 20 meters further back. Before them, the land dropped into a bowl filled with a carpet of creeping vines and leaves that reminded him of the grape fields of Enigrad. Within the carpet of vines and vegetation was a circular pool, about 30 meters across, of crystal clear water that Serpendis could see all the way through to the bottom, which appeared to be layer upon layer of crisscrossing roots and vines. Water plants and flowers ringed the edge of the pool. Lily pads and lotus blossoms floated gently on the water's surface, while patches of orchids speckled the trunks of the surrounding trees. A narrow waterfall from high above, on the opposite side from where they stood, cascaded down in a gentle vertical torrent that fed the pool. Off to the left, Serpendis saw a babbling stream fed from the pool's water, disappearing deeper into the forest. In the middle of the pool, rising from the bottom and standing well above the water's surface, was a stone statue of a woman with long hair, pointed ears, and celestial beauty, with her arms reaching upwards and her legs together as if in a slow dance. From where they stood, they were eye-level with the statue's face, and it looked directly at them. It seemed to Serpendis that ages of time had worn down the statue, eroding its details into soft abstractions that only increased the statue's otherworldly and mysterious beauty. Vines and leaves crawled up the statue's torso from the water, and upon the statue's head were fine cracks where little weeds and flowers grew. He tried to imagine the statue as it looked like the day it was completed. "Oh my," he said shakily. "Come, there is more," said Piecora, and she led him carefully down the escarpment and into the deep underbrush of the bowl, staying clear of the pool. Karui was in the lead, and Serpendis saw Hiero fly behind the waterfall and into a dark cave. But then came something above waterfall that halted all of them in their tracks. A great rack of antlers, dozens of points each, suddenly appeared over them, followed by the largest elk that Serpendis had ever seen in his life. He surmised at least 6 humans could ride on the back of it. It came into view completely silently, its footfalls hidden beneath the constant wash of the waterfall and the stirring breeze within the bowl. Raising its head, it let out a loud, shrill bugle that echoed over all of the surrounding forest. "Gods!" Serpendis whispered. He looked at Piecora, standing next to him, and she seemed tense, as if barely containing multiple fronts of conflict within herself. Her face was fixated on the monstrous elk above them, her brow furrowed deeply and lips pursed. Karui slowly backed toward them while staring at the beast above them. The elk then slowly laid down, and Hiero flew back out from the cave beneath it and hooked upward and around to land right next to the elk. The elk's massive head leaned toward the falcon, sniffing it with nostrils large enough for the bird to fit inside. Piecora sighed and said deeply and angrily, "Stag comes to me now, to show me how close I came to dying yesterday, passing through the shadow and entering the plains of its realm where Stag and its followers wander free. It is a fate I long for, but only at the end of my life, when my body is broken or spent and no longer has purpose. I must have gotten its attention." "Why is it here?" asked Karui. "It reminds me of the cycle, that today is the beginning of a new one," Piecora answered. "But I must choose. It is here to carry me away, if that is my choice. I can go now and be with my ancestors, those few who cheated the hermit and found their afterlives within the realms of their totems. Hero is ready, but I am not ready. I am not ready!" she suddenly shouted. Her voice rang clearly over the waterfall and bounced back from the cliff they faced and the surrounding ancient trees. Stag slowly stood and turned. Hero spread his wings wide, hopping high off the ground, and screeched. "No!" Piecora pleaded desperately. Reaching forward with her arms outstretched, Karui caught her from falling into the pool, and Serpendis fell onto his butt without Piecora's support. "I need you! Don't go!" Piecora implored, her voice shaking with emotion. "Please! Not yet!" Serpendis realized she was hysterically petitioning Hero to stay, and apparently Hero wanted to go with Stag. If Hero were to leave, he couldn't imagine what that would do to Piecora. Stag silently left the edge of the waterfall, and Hero flew up and circled erratically overhead, sometimes disappearing from behind the top of the cliff. Piecora struggled against Karui's embrace, crying, "I know it's all too much. I know how hard this is. I hate this forest as much as you do. But please don't give up. Spirits, don't leave me. I can't do this without you." A long, abstract moment of time elapsed when Hero was gone from view, seemingly forever. The only thing Serpendis heard was the waterfall and Piecora sobbing on Karui's shoulder. Again, he felt overcome with loss and hopelessness. "We will not survive Kiahalla, and what audacity we had for even trying," he thought to himself. Then Piecora looked up, choking between tears. "Oh, thank the spirits. Thank you for coming back." Serpendis looked around wildly for Hero until finally the raptor emerged from above the tree line behind them. Piecora laughed and cried simultaneously while saying, "He followed Stag to its fields, escorting and sending Stag off properly." She laughed again, while wiping her eyes and face with her hands, still in Karui's arms. He thought about leaving. He was tempted by it. But he's here. He's here. We're together. Spirits don't ever do that to me again, you little tit. She suddenly reached down and quickly yanked Serpendis up, nearly pulling his arm out of its socket. He was bewildered by everything now, the forest, the creatures, the lack of any sense of time, the mists in the mornings, the creatures at night, that horrible eye, and the horrible imitator that ambushed them and nearly killed them all. And now this place of serene, bucolic beauty that he's convinced hides something watchful and malevolent. And this brief exchange between Piecora, Stag, and her soul-bonded falcon Hero had him reeling from any standard metric of reality he once knew. He felt his entire grasp of sanity slipping away. It was all just too much for him at this point, and he wondered if Hero felt the same way. He watched Hero swoop in behind the waterfall and thought, "I might have left too, my friend. We're not built for this place." Piecora tugged him forward, and the three of them made their way to a slippery ledge of stone covered in vines and leaves that led to a recess in the cliff behind the waterfall. Here the floor was soft earth and rock, and the ceiling was plenty high enough to stand up straight. Vines, roots, and flowers fell from the top of the opening like decorated tendrils of hair behind the curtain of water falling in front of the cave. Serpentis noticed in the cool, failing light that the cave was well supplied with crates, barrels, piles of cloths and leathers, even racks with weapons and armor. Several wood tables had tools laid out on them. One table appeared to be reserved for mending wounds. Large canvas sacks of various foods and spices, fruits and vegetables, casks of spirits and kegs of water were all collected in the back. Rabbits, badgers, fish and birds of various sizes and colors hung from the ceiling, and a fire pit was carved into the middle of the stone floor. Torch sconces along the walls held unlit torches. Karui went about lighting the torches so there was plenty of light in the cave as the night approached. Piecora left him standing there in the middle as she jogged to the back of the cave. Someone lives here?" he asked incredulously. "My guess is it's a Scythian camp," he heard Piecora say, "perhaps as a waypoint on one of their patrol routes." "Do we not want to draw attention to ourselves, then? Perhaps we shouldn't," he muttered, pointing a shaking finger at Karui. But Piecora was already at his side again, with her arms around a bundle of clothes. "It's fine," Piecora said. "Karui says we're fine here, that monsters avoid this place. She'll still summon Siru to watch over us, but if we attract attention, it'll be the right kind. We deserve a good night's sleep after our recent ordeal. If a wandering Scythian patrol finds us, then they can take us right into Cynthia. Here, take those rags off and put these on. You'll feel better." She pushed the bundle into his stomach, nearly knocking him over. "I'll make us a feast tonight." And then she was off rummaging through the foodstuffs while Karui prepared the fire pit. He wandered to the back of the cave, unbuckled his knife belt, and let fall his once fine robes with all their hidden pockets. He then put on the large sleep shirt that Piecora gave him. Its fabric was soft, smooth, and light. Karui laid out 3 bedrolls around the fire and placed large pillows on them. Then she came toward him and grabbed the discarded robe, dragging it toward the front of the cave. Piecora hastily laid down 3 large plucked birds and filled bowls with various berries. She then cut up carrots, potatoes, beets, radishes, and zucchini into a large pot filled with water, and then hung it from a spit over the fire. The smell from the food made Serpentis's mouth water as he slowly walked back to the fire and sat down on one of the bedrolls. He felt like he could fall over at any moment and sleep for a week. Serpentis sat cross-legged on his bedroll near the fire, covered in a blanket. It was cold and damp inside the cave. Piecora slouched with her back against one of the barrels, her legs splayed out before her, with her arms folded. Hero sat on the ground between her feet, cleaning himself. Karui walked slowly along the cave walls, tracing her hand over their stone surface. All 3 held a wooden mug of a hot, sweet mead that Piecora brewed for them over the fire. It was the perfect libation for this moment, Serpentis thought, while cupping it close to his face. "These marks are the ones I told you about, Pie," Karui said absently to Piecora, using her shortened nickname for her friend. "It is an old Scythian script. This is a sacred place to the Eldar. It is called Snaman Abranrionai Vyoyen, Pool of the Queen, or Pool of Vyoyen," Karui said. "It is a place of peace and safety, but something troubles me. See over here. It says Iadsi Damhai Reanmha Gusroile, those who live and fight, and An de Airma Ditha, the forgotten." She turned to face them, placing her hands on her hips. "What does all that mean? What are they fighting? Why are they forgotten? What's happening in Cynthia? Pool of the Queen. Is that who the statue is outside? Piecora asked. Yes, Vyoyen is the goddess queen who came down to Aeonwyrm in the beginning of days, and from their union came the Eldar, and from the Eldar came elvenkind. A long moment passed with only the sound of the waterfall outside and the flickering of the fire pit and the torches on the walls. Not one of them could deduce what the script carved into the cave walls meant, and they were all exhausted. "You saved my life yesterday, Serpendis," Piecora said after a while, leaning her head toward him and her eyes half closed. "I will never forget that." "Was it yesterday? Or the day before, or—" he said lightly, feeling a little tipsy from the hot mead and his own fatigue. "I'm beginning to lose track of all the saving going on, my girl. Who saves who anymore? Bah, no point in auditing the books at this point. Our debts have merged into a singular coffer of love, loyalty, and trust that we may all dip from whenever we please. There is no keeping score. That is what family is. We have all seen too much at this point, but we still have each other, and sooner or later you'll save me again, or she'll save us both again. Come to think of it, when can we return her the favor? I'm afraid if it comes to that, it would be too late. We are lost without her," Piecora said, then looked at Karui. "How lucky we are to have you at our side, Karui." Karui walked over to Piecora, bent down, and kissed the top of her forehead, and then did the same to Serpendis. But as she straightened, her eyes lingered on his knife. "Where did you find that? May I see it?" she asked. Serpendis shifted his weight, drew the pointed weapon from its sheath, and handed it to Karui, the point facing back toward him. She took it and walked to her bedroll, sat down heavily, and examined the knife, occasionally holding it up in the firelight. "What do you think it is, Karui?" he asked. "A bone from the arm, perhaps? Too small for the leg, I think." She looked past the weapon and met his eyes through the flickering fire. "This is a tooth," she quipped, her voice cracking. "A what?" he asked, dumbfounded. She held it up vertically, its point facing up and lit by the fire. "I said it's a tooth, not some carved bone, but a whole tooth. A unique weapon, perhaps ceremonial. I see no runes or symbols carved on it, but I feel its power. Immense power. It simmers in my hands when I focus on it, but I cannot learn any more. I fear it's beyond my reach." She stood up again and swung the knife a few times before handing it back to Serpendis. "This is a relic," she said soberly. "Ancient. It yearns to be used. Swinging it just now felt more like my arm being dragged along behind it. Be careful with it. We do not know what it can do, or how to properly wield it, or where it came from, or who made it. Where did you find it?" Serpendis took the weapon and sheathed it back on his belt. It was among the undigested equipment inside the hole that the rabbit creature thing left behind. A true wonder that we survived an attack from such a thing if it could kill one such as that knife's previous owner, she said. I can only assume they were a great warrior. "I also found these," Serpendis said, pulling one of the platinum coins from a small leather pouch he procured from the back of the cave. He made sure that his previous robe's hidden pockets were emptied before casting it aside. He flicked the coin at Karui with his thumb. She caught the coin and studied it. "A Cynthian coin, and a valuable one," she said. "Indeed," he agreed. "One of those could fetch a house in Coast Haven and set someone up for life." "How many of these do you have?" she asked. "About a dozen total," he said. "Spirits. Well, you got your reward after all, eh, merchant?" Piecora said. Serpendis looked at Piecora, feeling wounded by her jab, but then softened when he realized he deserved it. He untied the pouch from his belt and tossed it over to Piecora. "I should give these to you, so you never have to deal with the wild lands again," he said. Go back to Siena, teach your people about Hiero and your soul bond, that each one of them has someone waiting for them, someone to complete them. Wake them up from their slumber, and then go deal with Lacranus. Those coins could turn his own army against him, I would wager. She tucked her knees up and peered into the pouch, but then quickly threw it back to Serpendis. I don't see how wealth can change anything in my country, she said. Then I'd come with you, and we'd create a campaign bent on changing the hearts and minds of your people. This requires that kind of wealth. Campaigns cost money, and those coins are more than enough, I would think. Piecora laughed, and it was a good, hearty laugh, like a release of tension. You are such an old fool, Serpendis. Everything is an investment with you. I am not in the business of changing hearts and minds, even if it's for the better, even if I was able, and if I had all the money in the world. People make their own decisions as they may. It is not their fault to be seduced by Tecurai. Their love for the hermit is baked in bedrock through hundreds of generations. It's in our blood. No amount of wealth can change that. She then tilted her head. No, if we were to deal with the hermit, we would confront him directly. She slowly moved her hand forward, palm to the side, pointing with all 4 fingers. Go right to the source. Get rid of him, and then the people will wake up, she said. A very direct approach, very Sienian, Serpendis replied. Perhaps you are right. Maybe that is the only way. Remove the snake, and the poison drains from the system. Want to know what I actually had planned for this wealth? He poured the coins onto the stone floor. The fire glinting from their platinum surfaces danced on their faces as they fell and spun in the dirt. When I get home, I shall build a monument in Coast Haven to those who fell to the Banwa on Undying so many moons ago. What do you mean? Asked Karui. Suddenly Serpendis realized that all this time she never knew about what happened to his caravan. Slowly he recounted the tale, but this time he didn't embellish it, nor did he change anything to suit his own narrative. He remained truthful about it all. My greed is why I am alive, and my ignorance is why my fellow travelers are all dead. You have every right to kill me right now where I sit, he said, staring soberly into the fire. He was too exhausted now to even feel shame or grief. He knew the Banwa massacre would haunt him for the rest of his life, and there would be plenty more time for tears when he could properly grieve. Do not bear this burden so much alone, dear merchant, Karui said softly. Her unexpected soothing voice settled on him like ointment for his soul. I now understand why you feared me when we first met. I do not hold anything against you, although I too now grieve for those who died. But say not that they died for your ignorance or your greed. Rather, say that my people are too quick to violence, too fearful of strangers. The Banwa attacked your people, unprovoked, in the middle of the night, while they slept. This is unforgivable. There is no honor in this. They saw your company and fear took hold over them, leaving no chance for dialogue, no opportunity for diplomacy. It is unthinkable what my people did to you, even knowing that you stole offerings from our altar. There are other ways to deal with that, and besides, they returned to where they belong, didn't they? They now sit in my altar, in my tree near the edge of the forest. Not all of us are so violent, and we strive against each other on these issues. Had I been there that night, I would have fought against them, but it would be no use at all, for my people move as one like the cloud of sparrows, and if fear takes us over, more tempered minds stand little chance of changing what happens next. It takes over all of us, and we act as one. This is how we have survived for so many ages on the plains. She came over to Serpendis and wrapped her arms around him. I wish I could change what happened, but know that you no longer carry this burden alone. I now carry it too. I grieve with you for your people. There is no forgiveness for what my people did that night. I can only hope that healing may come with time and with honoring those lost." She pressed the Cynthian coin he flicked at her into his hand and said, "Honoring your dead with this wealth is a noble purpose that I would share with you, if you would let me. Then perhaps a dialogue can begin between our two nations." Serpentis was awestruck by her words, but before he could respond, she kissed his forehead again and strode back to her bedroll and laid down. "It is time for sleep, then," Piecora said, shifting herself down into her blanket. Serpentis laid his head down onto his pillow, unable to remember a time when he felt such comfort. "I am thankful we are together," he mumbled, and then fell into deep sleep. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.